Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Terrence Johnson, your host this evening. Callie Crossley has the night off. Tonight, young, gifted, and stressed Gen Z and millennials of color. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. Young people of color are redefining how they wish to live their lives. They showed up and spoke out during the height of the pandemic after the murder of George Floyd. They are socially conscious and technically savvy, but stress, anxiety, and depression are a growing concern for Gen Z and millennials. Student loan debt and lost wages have delayed building wealth. Reports of older millennials who turn 40 this year suffer from health issues like diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, all diseases prevalent in Black and brown communities. What do young people of color think about their future as they make their way through life and into the work world? Joining us remotely, Rutba Shavani, a City Awake Advisory Board member and operations lead at Accenture Innovation Hub Boston. Oscar Lopez Jr., member of the Spark Council. He's also the legislative aide to State Representative Kevin Honan. Katrina Moore, director of the Africana Center at Tufts University, and therapist, mental health advocate, author, and podcaster, also known as Celeste the Therapist, Celeste Visser. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. I really want to start this conversation, this discussion, by defining these groups of people that we're talking about, right? Millennials are individuals who were born between 1981 and 1996, and Gen Z is essentially 1997 to 2015. And one of the things that I think so many people can relate to is the stress of finances, right? The stress of money. Oscar, can you really walk us through when you realized that finances and financial security were bringing about a different level of emotional anxiety or stress for you personally?
How much time do you have? No, I mean, ever since I was young, to be quite honest, both my mother and father are blue-collar job workers. Family is six. Penny pinching is kind of a way of life for me. And even now, when I think about starting my own family, the biggest thing I think of moving forward, I would say, is how do I provide and give the education that was provided to me to however many kids I may have in the future. If I even want kids. I do want kids, but yes, that's always in the back of my mind.
Right. I think what you're hinting at, or what you're really talking about here, is this idea of life expectations as well, right? Planning for the future. And I think a component of that maybe we realize, but not really, is how social media really compounds all of those emotions. And so, Celeste, I really want your opinion, your take on how you feel social media is really adding to life expectations in maybe unattainable ways, and how people are really working through those emotions.
Yeah, that's really good. And I want to make sure people understand that we allow social media to put the pressure on us because we have free will. But I think, when we're in an environment that promotes you're supposed to be doing this and you're supposed to be doing that, not just social media, but just our culture in general, there is this added pressure that we feel. But I do believe that it's important for us to kind of stay mindful of our choices in our environment so that we're not kind of allowing the pressure to kind of lead us in a path that creates more stress for us.
I completely hear that. And I think, a lot of people, when we go to college, right, and beyond, there's definitely added pressure there. This idea of hitting certain benchmarks, getting certain internships, getting certain fellowships, graduating, getting a job, right? All of these added pressures. And Katrina, I know that you are at a university in this environment. What are those conversations like that you're having with your students, right? Your Black students in particular. How are you navigating those conversations with those young people?
You're absolutely right. There has been an additional sense of what am I going to do? And we are really trying through our programming at the Africana Center to help the students to be able to think more clearly about their career aspirations. We have seen a lot more students coming into Tufts who are interested in the sciences or the STEM fields. And they have this sense that they have to find jobs that are going to sustain not only them, but their families as well. And so we are really trying to help them to take the time that they have had in isolation on the campus to do really a lot of self-reflection, to really hone in on what is it that makes me happy, and really have a focus on what their passions are, that to help guide them in the career choices that they are making.
That makes complete sense. I think, when we're having discussions about education and, professional goals, having that sense of clarity is really, really important. Rutba, I know that you are going back to school.
I am.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Congratulations on that. What was really your reasoning behind, wanting to continue your education? Were there outside pressures of trying to make sure you're being competitive with peers, or was this something that you have always wanted, especially considering how so many people are dealing with paying for college and student loan debt?
Absolutely. I think student loan debt and taking on more of it was definitely something that I was nervous about when deciding to go back to school. For me, it was more about my passions. Katrina, to your point, I found something that I feel really passionate about now. And I thought that getting more education was the best way for me to capitalize on that and really get into the field of social work. I'm going back to school for social work. And a lot of it came from my parents. I think, people of color can relate to the fact that our parents really prioritize education. I'm an almost older millennial, so my parents were really sad I haven't gotten a graduate degree. And so a lot of it also came from their influence when I was younger, that education is the key to bettering ourselves, to upward mobility. So lots of mixed things going into it, but I'm excited about it.
I'm glad you're excited. I know that, having support from your family, from your mentors is really, really important, especially when you're going back to school, but just throughout life in general, right? I think one of the things that is commonly said is that millennials and Gen Zers are entitled and lazy, and we don't want to put in the work, right? We're impatient. So Oscar, what do you say to that, knowing all of the parameters that you're dealing with, right? Or all of the obstacles and things that are really, challenging for you and adding stress to your plate? What do you say to that notion that millennials are just lazy and they should just suck it up and be patient?
Just all the easy questions again, huh? No, I guess what I would say first and foremost is going back to the mental health aspect of it is the imposter syndrome. A little bit of a whole of am I good enough? Work at State House. A lot of my peers and colleagues are white, and now I'm a lot of people of color working in this position that I'm working at. So it makes me feel like I got to work twice as hard just to meet a certain level of expectations set upon me in my position. And outside of that, just feels a little presumptuous that Gen Z millennials are just, I know we millennials in particular were known as the, participation trophies and what have you, just making sure that everyone felt included. And it's not a bad thing, but at the end of the day, I feel like that in itself is kind of carried on over into our adult lives, so the older millennials and what have you. And it feels like we all have kind of a chip on our shoulders to make sure that we exceed expectations. Most of my friends are actually getting their masters and really actually juggling between the immense debt that they'll have to go into and juggling whether they want to start a family. And it, to me, doesn't sound like that's lazy thinking at all. It just sounds like people are being very unimaginative of what the obstacles and the challenges that we as a generation face, especially now when we go through a pandemic. We've gone through, 2 financial crashes. I mean, when I become 60, I can't wait to tell these stories to my grandkids and make sure that they know what their granddad went through.
Right. We have to, of course, be aware and be honest about what we're experiencing, right? You talked about something, or you brought up a point that I think is really important, which is this idea of imposter syndrome that I think so many millennials and Gen Zers, especially as people of color, we experience in so many different ways. And it's important to have that, I guess, psychological safety, which is something we've talked about here before in our environments, right? These places where we feel like we can be ourselves. Katrina, I know that at Tufts, Ama Aji, which I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, was just elected as the first Black president of Senate at Tufts, right? And so how does that representation really help students align and see themselves and realize that they too are not imposters in their own environments?
Absolutely. And I also wanted to add to Oscar's point that we are seeing students who are not only not lazy, but they are really being very intentional in the internship opportunities that they are looking for. And if they can't find those, we have students who are starting their own businesses or their own outreach. We have students who have successfully partnered with major corporations to provide services and outreach for our students. And in the case of Ama, I mean, I talk to her on a regular basis, and she has just really, from the day that she started at Tufts, has really shown how leadership can, in a student, can flourish. And we are just so excited about the opportunity for her to step into this historic role and to really have the representation that has been lacking as far as students, BIPOC students on campus, to have someone who is going to elevate their voice and their concerns. And so I work with students all the time who are not afraid to speak up, who are not afraid to look for those opportunities that will enhance their career goals.
Yeah, and it's so important to continually be vocal and be honest about again, the experiences that we're having, but also expectations and holding systems accountable, which is something we really saw in 2020, right, at a different level. So Celeste, from your perspective, 2020 was a chaotic and traumatic year in a lot of different ways, but especially when we think about the social civil unrest, right? What are some ways, or how have you seen people of color, young people of color, really be a part of that movement, but also protect themselves, right? Because they were really leading the charge in a lot of ways during that time. So how have you seen those two things play out?
Yeah, I think 2020 put a spark in a lot of people, and people were out on the front lines in full force. I think initially people weren't protecting their emotional selves initially, and a lot of people got burnt out emotionally, and I think now people are beginning. We're talking about mental health and wellness more, so people are taking better care of themselves. But also, I think in the workplace, people are feeling a lot more comfortable with speaking up, partly due to the organizations and companies being more self-aware. I mean, one thing the pandemic allowed was a pause, and so people were forced to look at what was happening. So some companies are promoting, a workplace environment that allows for people to be seen. And some may not have done it, but I think people of color are just feeling more empowered to speak up about the things that have been going on, like within the workplace or within these systems that kind of exist here in America.
Right, you're exactly right. It's so important that we, as people of color, are able to bring our full selves to our work and what we do professionally, and not just bring our talents, right? Like we can actually be ourselves at work. So Rutba, I know, of course, you are a woman of color in the workspace, also re-entering the education space, right? Pursuing another degree. How does your own personal identity maybe add stress or anxiety for you in these spaces, right? Like, how do you manage being a woman of color in a leadership role professionally? And also, how are you imagining walking into that space educationally?
Absolutely. That's a big question for me. And Celeste, to your point, it started really thinking about myself and my role, especially in the last year, and being mindful and remembering, the biases that I bring, and also some of my weaknesses, the imposter syndrome, the culture that I grew up in. And I think it's really given me an ability to empathize. So at work, I am mindful about bringing people in. I'm mindful about when I'm holding myself back. And then hopefully giving folks grace as they need it. This has been a really challenging time for everyone for a lot of different reasons. And I think with going back to school, I'm hoping that my identity as a woman of color informs me to become a better social worker, but also I think there is a relationship between the field of social work and macro social work and corporate America. I'm excited to explore that gap. And I think being a woman of color is only going to enhance that. But I like to think that I'm using it as fuel to support the people around me and help myself grow.
Yeah, I hear that, and being able to leverage your time and your energy for other people, I think, is always commendable. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was this idea of mindfulness, right? Which is so important to being at peace with oneself and being secure in that, right? So I want Celeste, also known as Celeste the therapist, to really talk to us about what mindfulness is and maybe give us some tips on how we can practice mindfulness.
Yeah, that's really good. Every time I speak, that's the one thing I want people to take away. I believe that we have so much underutilized power within that, this culture in America doesn't promote. And, when we really think about what the culture promotes, it's a validation based off of like what we're doing, how much money we're making, what we have. And so even though we're in this environment that promotes this, and I don't think that's going to change in my lifetime, it doesn't mean that I can't do the things I need to do to make sure I'm not going at the pace of society. And I think that when we really stop and think about society is very chaotic. So who would really want to go at the pace of society? So for people that are listening and really are thinking deeply about this, practicing mindfulness really starts with where you are. Waking up in the morning, not grabbing your phone first thing in the morning, because if I start my day with my phone on social media, that's how I'm choosing to start my day, with all of the capitalistic things. And they want us to be insecure so we can buy and buy. And so when we're finding ourselves struggling, we have to start to ask ourselves, well, what are we doing with our time? And when we really are honest with ourselves, a lot of us are not spending it mindfully. We are going on the train and getting to a stop and not realizing like we're here already, because there's these gaps because we're just on autopilot. We can start in the shower. We take a shower every day. We can get in the shower, we can use our 5 senses and just kind of get grounded in the moment. It's really about being in the moment. And the more time we're spending in the moment, the less time we have to worry about our future or dwell on the past, right? If we're worried about our future, dwelling on the past, we're missing out on the moment. And so if we can learn how to like live in the moment, we'll find ourselves feeling peace, because that's the only thing we have control over right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That really resonated a lot with me personally. Oscar, I want to hear from you. Have you been practicing mindfulness? And if so, what does that look like for you on your day-to-day life?
I'm so sorry, Celeste. I work in politics, so the first thing I do is pick up my phone. I do have to practice mindfulness.
Oscar.
Well, I actually listened to your podcast the other day with Dr. Carrie Ann Williams, and it really hit a chord with me, simply because, and I'll bring it right back to your point about mindfulness, is that a lot of the child therapists, and you're talking about immigrant children and migrants and being first generation here. And I think my mindfulness really stems from the fact that it goes right back to that whole imposter syndrome. I feel like a duck on the water sometimes. And most of the times it's really just because I have to represent my family, like my mother and my father came here for a very specific purpose. And it was to give me and my brothers and sisters a better shot than they had. And, the mindfulness I try to practice, or I try not to be as hard on myself as I am most of the time, but most of the time I'm muttering to myself, like, why did I do this? Why did I do that? And I'm trying to practice maybe more self-love in that sense. So, but it's hard. It's an uphill battle, to say the least.
Yeah, wanting to not only exceed expectations, but really represent well, it really adds to so many things that we're worried about constantly. And so giving yourself that self-love and that grace is really, really important. Katrina, I know that you have probably had many experiences where you've had to find peace and mindfulness. So what are some things that you've shared with your students and other people of color to help them recenter themselves?
We are very fortunate that we have liaisons in our counseling center, and Dr. Damon Pryor and Dr. Candace Auguste Burke have put together a wellness guide. And so it's a great way for our students to be able to go to this one place and find lots of resources, lots of different kinds of resources to help them with their in the sense of well-being and their mindfulness. And I use that site all the time to find various ways that I can manage some of the stress that I deal with on a regular basis. And I know that our students this year, in addition to that, we have had a real focus on well-being. And so the limited times that we have been able to be together in socially distanced gatherings, we have had a focus on well-being and doing stretches together and having conversations about, going deeper into not just how are you doing, but how are you really doing, and what are you doing to help not just you, but your friends or your classmates. And so I'm really excited about the extra outreach that we have been able to do to focus on our students' well-being, because they have been in a very unusual mode this year and spending a lot more time separated from their friends and their extracurricular activities, which has really caused them to need that kind of focus.
Right. Thank you for that, Katrina. Rubba, I want to go to you before we have to wrap things up. What are some ways that you also practice mindfulness and keep yourself aligned on the day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big hiker. So I'm originally from Metro Atlanta, and it's been amazing living here in New England. You've got so many mountains. So I hike. I usually do that alone. It's really great for me to just be in nature and with myself. I listen to podcasts. I read. So I think for me, it's just spending time with my thoughts, allowing me to ground myself, really get present instead of dwelling or thinking about the future. So those are some of the things that I do.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for sharing ways to stay mindful, stay aligned, and stay centered. Those are some of the things that I personally try to practice as well. It can be a challenge, like we've all talked about, because there are so many things that we are committed to and so many expectations that we have for ourselves. But having that mindfulness is really, really important. So thank you all for sharing that. That is the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. We are on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on young, gifted, and stressed, Gen Z and millennials of color. So I want to talk about something that we didn't get a chance to earlier, which was this idea of, well, not this idea, this important notion of being vaccinated, right? The COVID-19, coronavirus challenged and stopped our world in so many different ways. But a recent study showed that about 40% of millennials said they will only get vaccinated if they had to. And so, Rutba, I'm going to come back to you. What's your take on the importance of vaccination, and have you personally had the vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it was very much a selfish choice. I wanted my life to get back to normal. I miss traveling. I miss, freely going to see my family. I've got some hilarious stories about the one time I flew down to them over last summer. And so I think it was just, how do I get myself back to normal? I've gotten my first vaccine. My second one is scheduled for next week. So I'm pretty pumped about that. And also a little scared to get sick if that happens. But I think it's incredibly important. And then also thinking outward to keep everyone else safe as well. So kind of twofold there.
Right. It's so important that we all stay as safe and healthy as possible. Katrina, I want to hear from you because you work at a university where there's a lot of young people. How has that conversation been about the COVID vaccine, right? Are you seeing a lot of young people wanting to participate in that process and protect themselves and other people around them? Or what's that been like from your perspective?
I think that our students are very excited about the ability to actually get the vaccine on campus. We were waiting for a while for that to happen. And the university also made the decision that in the fall, you will need to be vaccinated to come back to campus. And so I haven't seen or heard a lot about students' hesitation in taking the vaccine. It will help them to be able to get back to, particularly for the student organizations, to get back to having gatherings and to have events. And I'm sure they're very excited about the recent CDC suggestion that we can not wear a mask. I'm personally not going to stop wearing mine. But I think that they're I have not heard a lot about students resisting getting the vaccine.
I personally don't know a lot of people in my friend group who have been resistant against the vaccine either. I do know there has been a lot of vaccine deliberation, right? And I don't want to say vaccination hesitation because I think that leaves a different connotation, right? People are deliberating about whether they want to get the vaccine or not, and rightfully so for a lot of people. So Celeste, how important is it that we intentionally acknowledge the process of deliberation when it comes to this vaccination process, and not necessarily just acknowledging the deliberation there, and how we may or may not want to participate in that process?
Yeah, I love the fact that you said deliberation, because I think that's what it is. I'm seeing 50-50. There are some people that are for it and some people that are not for it. And I think it's, I feel like there's a lot of shame that goes on with people who choose not to do it. And there's so much, racial bias that have existed in the medical system for so long. And that still happens today. And so, like, for people that choose to get it, it's fine, and people who choose not to get it, I understand why, especially the way it rolled out. So I think it's important to honor people's process, as they're trying to figure out what works for them, especially given the history that has happened here in our culture in America.
Right. That history is so important, and it's also equally important that we acknowledge that. So, Oscar, I want to know, are you skeptical at all about the vaccine? Where are you on this field? Are you vaccinated? What's that look like for you?
So I'm vaccinated, and I think it was great that you started off with instead of hesitancy, deliberation, because to Celeste's point, the history in this country between people of color and medicine in general has been fraught with, let's say, mishaps, for lack of a better word. And my family themselves in Guatemala, just what was it, years ago, I forget what year, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, came out and apologized for the U.S. experiments on Guatemalan cities for testing gonorrhea, what have you. And just that one story, my uncles, my mother, my father have a bunch of them, and they don't have hesitancy in getting the vaccine because first and foremost, they see it as they're taking it for others, not for themselves, protecting the family around them and obviously themselves. But for the most part, it's like family's history, a lot of medical complications. They just don't want to worry about family that they could otherwise protect. And it's kind of rough because, again, to Celeste's point, you have to meet people where they are. Yesterday, I was at a Get Out the Vax clinic over in Fidelis Way, right up the street from in Brighton, and we had 20 people show up, got their first dose, and had a lot of conversations with people that just were not going to take it simply because they just didn't trust the process, didn't like how it was being rolled out, the huge Johnson & Johnson scare of 95% accuracy. And it's rough sometimes, just because, like, at the end of the day, you want to go back to some type of normal, but you also want to make sure that, you're meeting people where they are and not forcing something that clearly is fraught with a lot of history that you want to be sensitive to.
I feel like there's a lot of conversations about meeting people where they are in a lot of different ways, especially after 2020, right? Specifically, I want to talk about how systems of power are, or how systems of power are meeting people of color where they are, especially after 2020, right? This idea of holding jobs, government accountable has been a conversation that has definitely been pushed to the forefront. And so, Rutba, how are you either leaning into that accountability with your own teams and your own environments that you operate. How have you played out those conversations where it's imperative that those systems meet you where you are as a person of color after the year of social unrest in 2020?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing has been enabling and also making sure that I am speaking up. I have found so much hope and so much goodness in the fact that millennials and Gen Z, especially Gen Z, have been so great about speaking up now and really holding the systems around them accountable. And for me, that's been really meaningful. I think just getting in there and starting to do the work, part of going back to school came from that as well. How could I best serve my communities? And so I think that's it. I think we have to speak up and we have to keep doing it. And it's hard, and you take a step back. I always say you can't give from an empty vessel. So, you take a step back, you fill yourself back up, and then you go out there and you speak up some more. And for me, that's the best way and the most hopeful way to really hold our systems accountable.
Right, being vocal.
Yeah.
Katrina, I really want to speak to you because education in particular is a system that has a lot of layers when it comes to protecting and advocating for students of color. So after the year of 2020, now that students are at Tufts, how have you really been able to be a leader and be a pillar of the academic community and also have honest conversations with students of color at Tufts? So what has that looked like for you?
It's been a very interesting year in that regard. And I think that our students and not just our students, but our faculty and staff as well, are at a place where we are moving from this performative type of way that we have been interacting with each other and moving more to transformative resistance. And so we are I spend time talking to our students to help them not just understand what's happening at the moment, but to dig deeper into the history of how we got to where we are. And then to go after those things that are of concern to them in a way that is beyond making sure that we have the right words that we're using, but we are also putting action behind those words to move us forward. Our university president came out last summer, and we have been moving in the direction of making Tufts an anti-racist institution. And I think that was the catalyst for me to be able to have those hard conversations with our students to help them to be able to speak up when there are things that are not going as they would like to see them, but not just to speak up, but to also have actionable plans that we could present. And there have been changes that have been made this year, and we're looking forward to continuing that work in the fall.
Right. Continuing that work, moving forward, and also understanding the history as you talked about. Oscar, I'm also really interested in hearing from you because as a person of color, second generation Guatemalan American, who's working for a state representative, I'm sure that these conversations around social justice and intentionality are coming up around the clock. And so from your perspective, what has that been like to work with the state representative and a team that is really, for the people, working for the people?
I think it's really, I've been really blessed to work with someone who has been first and foremost a mentor and an ally at the end of the day. A state representative who's been here for 30 years, who's known the neighborhood. He's born and raised here. And I think at the end of the day, it's really like kind of seeing how the hot dogs are made a little bit, working at the state level and seeing legislation getting made, getting passed, and then seeing how it affects your community. My entire background before even entering politics was in nonprofit. And my dad, when he was 21, he'd just walk around the neighborhood, make himself known. And it's just kind of like, hey, you need some help. You need a couple dollars here and there. He's well known for buying used cars that are a foregone conclusion, should really just go to the trash heap, but buying them anyway and helping people out in those ways. And, just trying to be a center in the community to kind of just be out there. And so it kind of feels like that reflects more in my nonprofit and then political life. And then on top of that, seeing how those little things build up into these pieces of legislation like the Safe Communities Act that help our immigrant communities and people that are just coming here for a better life, just like how my father did and my mother. It's kind of full circle. It's really, again, duck on the water, imposter syndrome all over again. But I'm trying my best out here.
Right. As my mom always says, you're doing great. Celeste, before we go, I just want a couple quick thoughts from you on how, carrying this torch and being honest and vocal, how it affects us. And, maybe if you have any advice for those young people out there or any people out there who are still advocating and working for social change.
Yeah. So, on paper, systems are changing, in these organizations. I'm a full-time entrepreneur, but as a therapist, I hear these stories. On paper, it's changing. It's going to take a while before the whole, as change happens, a lot of people struggle with that change, especially if they've had privilege. And so on paper, maybe rules change, but transitioning, maybe not so much. So for people that may be struggling with the dynamics, because you got to remember, before these companies got on board, people have been suffering internally for a while, and we have to survive. We need the job to get paid, to pay our bills. So we've been putting up with it. And so even though systems are changing, it's important to continue to stay mindful when you leave that job or you leave that organization, because the energy is real, passive aggressive things happen. And so sometimes people will go crazy in their head and isolate and keep it all in. Don't keep it all in, write it down, join a networking group of people that may have similar experiences. The more community you have, the more less likely you feel alone. So really be mindful of the way that you're spending your time, especially if you're finding yourself struggling in some of these organizations and that are trying to change, but it's been that way for so long. So there's no way possible that change would have happened overnight, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes complete sense. Finding community is so important. And so I want to thank you all for being here and sharing your perspectives, your thoughts with our community. We appreciate it. Thank you for being here and have a good one.